Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the CDCR Board of Directors and staff, I'd like to welcome you to the kickoff of the 17th Annual Reshaping Rochester Lecture Series. My name is Monika Reifenstein, and I'm the Interim Executive Director of the Community Design Center. This year's theme is the ideal city. Each year through our lecture series, the CDCR aims to open dialogue around urban planning, design strategies, and issues of equity that contribute to the revitalization of our region. We continue to be interested in how inclusion and equity impact the way that we think about and create space. Over the course of the series this year, we plan to discuss what it means to be ideal, communities that might be categorized as ideal, and if and how our own communities could become ideal. The CDCR was founded in 2003, which means that we are celebrating nearly 2 decades of service in the greater Rochester region. Our mission is to promote the creation of vibrant, equitable, and resilient communities. And we do this by engaging, educating, and empowering stakeholders in crafting purposeful design. I'd like to take this time to introduce our board members, starting with our executive committee. We have Monika McCullough, our board president, Bill Price, vice president, Stephanie Annunziata, our treasurer, and Vanessa Villeneuve, our secretary. Our at-large members are Howard Decker, Jean Dupre, Eugenio Marlin, Michael Pratico, Miriam Jacob, and Tanya Zweilin. We thank you all for your commitment, guidance, and support. I'd also like to recognize and thank the New York State Council on the Arts, who has made our work possible through their generous support for 17 years. And especially this year, they've awarded us a larger than usual grant, and we really appreciate that. It really makes a difference. We also appreciate the support of individuals in our community. Our circle of friends is made up of people and businesses who have donated $500 or more to our general operating. A big thank you goes out to everyone on this list, and we also extend an invitation to any of you who value the work that we do to join our circle. We gratefully acknowledge the ESL Charitable Foundation for their sustaining generosity and support of the series at the gold sponsor level, as well as the Rochester Area Community Foundation for their support at the silver level. Special shout out to today's event sponsor, Hevron & Company CPAs, for their longstanding support and for being our event sponsor today. And a special happy tax season to you. I'd also like to take this time to acknowledge all future event sponsors for the series, which includes the Community Preservation Corporation, Bergman, Hanlon Architects, and RG&E. Couldn't do it without you. Thank you to WXXI for being our exclusive media sponsor and AA Rochester for sponsoring our continuing education credits. They've been doing that for us for quite some time and we really appreciate it. As well as Hedonist Artists and Chocolates for providing speaker gifts each year. We truly appreciate all of our supporting sponsors and lecture series friends. We thank all of you. And finally, I'd be remiss if I didn't take this opportunity to also recognize all those behind the scenes that make the lecture series possible. Our lecture series planning committee, you can see all of their names listed out there, as well as Trisha and Kelly at Marshall Partners. We've been working with them this year and they've been wonderful. Thank you. Just a heads up, at the end of the program, a survey will pop up on your screen. We do ask that you please take that. We read all of your responses and we take them to heart, and they impact all of our future programming. Today's presentation has been approved for CNU A credits and AICP credits. CNU A credits are self-reported by members. But if you're wishing to receive AICP credit, you can go ahead and click a Google Doc link that I'll be posting in the chat to log your attendance. I'd also like to note that AIA credits are still under approval. It's possible that that approval will come through today, in which case it would still be relevant for all those in attendance who'd like to receive that. So you are also welcome to put your name on the attendance list that I'll be posting in the chat soon. It is a Google Doc. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce today's featured speaker, Rick Cole. Rick Cole was recently selected by the CNU's board of directors to be their 5th executive director since the organization's founding 3 decades ago. He brings unique experience as an elected local official, city manager, and urban policy expert to his role leading the staff of CNU. As past mayor of Pasadena, California, Cole was among the first elected officials in the nation to embrace new urbanism, leading an effort to rewrite the city's general plan to embrace timeless ways of building new human-scale development around the coming of light rail transit. Later, as the city manager of Azusa, he spearheaded the first citywide form-based code in California, a new urbanist tool for producing high-quality design. Cole also championed civic engagement, affordable housing, complete streets, green building, and community well-being as the city manager of both Ventura and Santa Monica. As deputy mayor for budget and innovation for the city of Los Angeles, he oversaw a $5 billion budget and secured a $3.2 million grant from Bloomberg to maximize community reinvestment that benefits existing residents. Please join me in welcoming Rick Cole as he takes us through a presentation of A City That Works for Everyone.
Thank you, Monica. It is great to be part of this series to kick it off this morning, and to recall that I spent the first 5 years of my life in Rochester, in a little house on Coldwater Road, and we'll talk a little bit about the evolution of the suburbs as we get into my talk. I'm going to start sharing screen here in a moment. And let's see if this is gonna. All right. So again, glad to have all of you joining this morning. Morning for me, afternoon for you. I'm in Pasadena, California. So the theme of the speaker series is the ideal city. And I think I'm going to make a case today that there is no such thing as an ideal city in terms of a destination, but it is critically important that we have in our hearts and in our minds and in our plans an ideal city as a journey. So I want to take us back on a journey to how we got where we are today. I think that's important to understand how we get to where we want to go tomorrow. The cities like Rochester, they blossomed in an era in American society when we were the envy of the world. People from all over the planet wanted to come to America. Tens of millions of them did. And they brought with them timeless ways of building from Europe, from Africa, from Latin America, from Asia. They brought ways that had been tested over thousands of years, ways that were compatible with climate, ways that drew upon local materials, ways that most of all emphasized human scale, because during those 5,000 years, transportation was primarily walking. And so cities were compact, so were towns, so were villages. And we learned as a species how to build places that were prosperous, that were safe, that would hold their value over time. I was just reading about Jerusalem. Jerusalem was attacked and taken over 43 times during its long history, and it was destroyed and totally burnt down twice in that history, and yet 4,000 years after its founding, it's still a place that people all over the world want to visit, and the three religions view as one of their most sacred places of origin, and it's still a place that that countries squabble over who gets to control. So that's the background for how we built our cities. And We built them around the turn of the century, and they were thriving places that again were the envy of the world. They were not without their problems. They were crowded, thrown together. They didn't grow up over hundreds of years. They grew up over uh, in some cases a handful of years. Chicago, before the Civil War, so in 1858, was about 35,000 people. By 1890, it was 1 million people. There had never been a place in the world that had grown so quickly as Chicago. So Chicago in 1893 decided to show off what had become of this great city, and they decided to build an ideal city on what we would today call wetlands, but in those days they called a swamp. They drained 1,200 acres on Lake Michigan, and they built the Great White City. It was the way to show off to Europe and the rest of the world that the little cousin had come of age and that we had a civilization as well as an industrial powerhouse. And so architects were unleashed to showcase an imaginary city, a city that 20 million Americans journeyed to see what a city could look like if it were planned, if it were built at a magnificent scale. And it launched something called the City Beautiful movement, which had impacts all over the country. People wanted to see something like Chicago in their own hometown. And often the most significant impact was in the civic center, an effort to mimic the neoclassical designs and the grand boulevards and the epic scale of the Great White City in Chicago. It's where Frank Lloyd Wright had his first exposure to Japanese architecture, which had a big influence on him. It was where the first Ferris wheel was shown off. It was where Wrigley's gum made its debut. It was an incredibly influential event in American history, and it captured the imagination of millions of people all over America. In fact, the mall in Washington, D.C. is a direct result of the 1893 World's Fair. They hired the main architect for Chicago to redesign the mall. At the time, the mall had a giant train station in it, the Union Station, which if you visit now, whether by train or just as a tourist attraction, that was relocated from the mall. And the mall had been butchered by lots of commercial uses. All that was cleared out. A space was made for the Lincoln Memorial, and what that magnificent space that we have as a nation was a direct result of the vision that was created in Chicago. Some years later, a half century later, America had been through World War One, had been through the Roaring Twenties, had been through the Depression, and in 1939, at the nadir of the Depression, so when America still had millions of unemployed people, General Motors spent $2.5 million at a time when $2.5 million would buy you almost anything. You could get the most famous designer in America for a cup of coffee and a ham sandwich. They spent it on creating an ideal city, an imaginary city, a suburban city. They drew on ideas that were then floating in the atmosphere about segregating houses from factories and shopping areas and educational institutions, of creating high-rise antiseptic downtowns that would clear out all of the disorder at the street level and create broad empty plazas. And they were going to connect all of this with the car. It was General Motors after all. And so they created this pavilion called Futurama. And people stood for up to 4 hours to go through this magnificent display. Remember, this is before television. Television actually debuted at the 1939 World's Fair. This was before theme parks like Disneyland. So this was an extraordinary thing to be able to look at to see in miniature what America could look like. And then the thing that was most impactful is after you got a tour of this miniature version of America, then you came out into the part of the pavilion where it was at scale. And there were cars that no one had ever seen that were future cars parked at the curb. It was an extraordinary show, and everybody got a button. You can get them on eBay these days for a lot more money than the free that you got it when you went through. And you had seen the future. And so when the folks who had seen this, 12.5 million of them, came back from World War II, they were primed not only to build it, but to buy it. And that's where we live today. It became national policy. We built the world's largest public works program in history, the interstate highway system, and we blew it through cities that had existed at a far different human scale. We subsidized outward sprawl in myriad ways, including paying for the public infrastructure, the home mortgage interest deduction, the federal guarantees on mortgages. All of those things made it easy and cheap to find housing for the generation that came back from World War II or that had been working in the factories while the GIs were overseas. Crucially, people of color were largely excluded through redlining, through overt discrimination and restrictive private covenants on housing, and through economic discrimination and personal discrimination, steered away from and often violently pushed out of these new suburban developments that began to surround all of America's cities. The result was the decline, inevitably, of the central cities as the middle class and the wealthy fled the cities. And the result was a massive program of surgery on cities to heal them. It was akin to bloodletting. Jane Jacobs called it the sacking of cities. An extraordinary number when you think that the country's population was 150 million and that 3.6 million people were uprooted. That's one of those statistics like billions and trillions that our eyes tend to glaze over. But every one of those 3.6 million was part of a family, had relatives, had lived in their neighborhood for a long time, went to church there or the synagogue. They had roots there. They had gone to school there. They had friends and family in the immediate neighborhood. All of them had to find a new home. It was extraordinarily disruptive on the lives of people. Many people lost their businesses forever. Many people lost their homes and the ability to own a home forever. And generations of folks who were locked out of the American dream. The result is extraordinary. We built a whole new country, a whole new suburban auto-oriented country around this ideal of Futurama. We spent trillions of dollars and decades creating this environment. At one sense, it was one of the great achievements of American history to be able to build a brand new country almost from scratch over the course of 30 or 40 years. China's doing something similar today with a very authoritarian bent to it. We did it with federal support and federal subsidy and sometimes brutal intervention like the demolition by eminent domain of whole neighborhoods. But we created this brand new place. The trouble is that this brand new place didn't really feel like a place anymore. We had forgotten the timeless ways of building. We'd forgotten around building around human beings. We were building instead around cars and making our whole landscape subservient to the automobile. And we've kind of, because it's taken 2 or 3 generations, we've kind of become inured to this. This is just the way it is. When something brand new like this opens up, we say, oh, that way I can get to the store a little bit quicker. We forget that once streets were vibrant with pedestrians, vibrant with commercial activity, vibrant with an ability of different races, different ethnic groups, different economic groups, different ages, to share a public realm. Now we spend our time, way much more of our time, behind the wheel or in the back seat, It takes a drive to get a gallon of milk. It takes a drive to get flowers for the table tonight. It takes a drive to get kids to the park. And we just become inured to the idea that we are spending billions of dollars every year to keep this infrastructure in place, and millions of dollars in every community for the gas, for the car payments, for the garage, for the parking, for the repairs, for the auto insurance. We've just taken it for granted that that's just a cost of modern life. And because we've been unleashed from human scale, we've segregated our uses so that people live in one place and they work another place and they go to school in yet another place. And all of that is not something that's an easy walk or bike ride from where you live or where you work. But instead, you've got to get in that car and drive, which makes it extraordinarily difficult if you're too young to drive, or if you're too old to drive, or if you are disabled, or you're simply too poor, or if you choose for environmental or social or personal reasons not to have to drive. This is not a landscape that is welcoming. It's far from ideal. This is what we used to build, in which young people could easily walk to the park. Older people were not shut off into old folks' homes by and large. There were back units and granny flats and cottages, and there were places for working people. There were boarding houses. There were duplexes. There were bungalow courts. All of that has been lost in a period of several decades. 30 years ago, the founders of New Urbanism said this is not sustainable, that the disinvestment in central cities was a colossal mistake, that the spread of placeless sprawl was something we would come to regret, that the increasing separation by race and income would divide our society, that our environment was being degraded, that we were losing prime agricultural land and becoming more and more dependent upon artificial fertilizers and foreign crops, and that those were coming, refrigerated 2 and 3 weeks old. That the wilderness that used to be pristine was being taken over by sprawl, and that we were losing some of the real gems that made America's towns and cities the envy of the world. And so that came from our charter. At the time, people dismissed it. They said, "Oh, it's a bunch of dreamers, a bunch of idealists. America has been built around the car. Our economy is dependent upon the car and the car industry. We need to build more roads. We need to build more suburbs. We need to continue to expand. That's what Americans want. They want a house in the suburbs. They want to be at the end of a cul-de-sac. You people don't know what you're talking about." And the problems that we saw coming, they dismissed. There's a quote often attributed to Gandhi. I'm sure he didn't say it, but it's a good one nonetheless. First, they ignore you. Then they make fun of you. Then they attack you, and then you win. We take no satisfaction that what we talked about 30 years ago is now coming due. That many of the issues that we raised 3 decades ago are now central to the national conversation. That the segregation by race and income, that the climate crisis, that the affordability crisis, that we're now having to borrow trillions of dollars to repair this infrastructure that was built around the car. We take no satisfaction that our words were prescient. In fact, what's frustrating to us is that now is the time to act on those threats. We should have been working on them 30 years ago, and now is the time, past time, to take action. And so this is our commitment that we made in the charter, that we want to take to every community, to Rust Belt communities, to rural communities that have been hit by disinvestment, to inner city neighborhoods. We believe that we need to reclaim the timeless ways of building and adapt them to the 21st century. That the ideal city is not something that the General Motors can hand to us on a platter. The ideal city is something that we make ourselves. So it means a different paradigm. It means not just tweaking around the edges. It means really a fundamental recapture of the way that people all over the planet for thousands of years understood about how to make great cities, towns, and villages. And to turn our back on the dispersed, divided, and disconnected world of Futurama and return to the compact and complete and connected world with solar energy, with modern technology, with larger bedrooms than our grandparents had. Those things are different, but the principles of the way people can live in harmony with each other and in harmony with nature, those have not changed, and it's time we rediscover them. So when New Urbanism first started 30 years ago, the easiest place for it to happen was in suburban communities, ironically enough, of building a different kind of suburbia, not a suburbia built around the car, but built around people. And those communities have been extraordinary successes. In fact, the great paradox has been the places that were meant to be welcoming and inclusive have become so successful that now, because very little planning was made for affordability, because it wasn't seen as a problem, now it is a problem. Over in the right-hand corner, though, we did a number of what were called Hope 6 projects, where really terrible public housing that had not been designed well in the first place and not been maintained well over decades was torn down for mixed income, which had great success, except then the funding got cut off. So we ended up with fewer low-income units than we started with. But it was a much better environment. Those communities have held their value and have become much safer and better places for people to live. So I'm going to go through some of the dimensions that we can work on that really matter to creating an ideal city. And it starts with having a vision. A vision of what kind of community you want, and not a vision just of elected leaders or civic leaders who head organizations and churches and businesses, but the community itself sharing a vision. And that's fundamental, that it not just be a civic layer of leadership who tell everybody, well, this is where we're going, but really deeply involving the community. I remember when we did this when I was mayor in Pasadena, and the planners told me, Rick, thousands of people really just aren't interested in the things that you want to talk about. They have other things to do. They have television shows, they have families, they have jobs. And I said, well, that's because we're asking them to talk about zoning and comprehensive planning and a lot of jargon that they don't understand. But if we talk to them about their kids' future, where they're going to work, how they're going to get to school, where they're going to retire, whether there's going to be a place they can afford in their own community, people do care about that. Everyone cares about that if they don't check their pulse. And they say, well, Rick, let's say you're right, and thousands of people will participate in this effort. What a nightmare, because we only give them 3 minutes to talk, and all they ever do is yell at us. And I said, well, that's crazy. We can get them around tables. We can get them talking to each other, not yelling at us, talking about the business person and the longtime resident and the young person, all to talk together about shared vision and shared values. We pulled that off, and the result was we had 3,200 people participate in a planning effort for our community. Not 300 people coming 10 different times, but 3,200 people coming 10 times to really reshape a vision for our community. A vision, by the way, that has had relevance now for 30 years. We see the results, and the general plan really that we worked on in those days, that is still the vision that our community rests on. In fact, now coming back to Pasadena after being gone in my public service career, I'm sort of frustrated that we haven't moved past that vision. And it's time perhaps to have a new modified vision for all the things we've learned in the last 30 years. The other thing that is crucial is design. The scale on the left and the right are identical. The street capacity on the left and the right are identical. But there's a huge difference in how people use what's on the right versus what they don't use on the left. This is a project that I visited recently in Milwaukee. At the top was the public housing that was there. At the bottom is what the Public Housing Authority has replaced it with. These are all affordable housing, all low income Section 8 units. The next phase is to bring into some of the neighborhood some mixed income and home ownership opportunities. This used to be cut off from the surrounding neighborhoods. Now it's connected to the surrounding neighborhoods. The neighbors were apprehensive at first about, they wanted to be cut off from the housing project, but when they saw it was being built, they ultimately welcomed this as an integral part of their neighborhood and not as a segregated enclave. It's not, design is not about taste or whether you like modern or Spanish or bungalow or English cottage. What design is about is a design for humans. Are there porches? Are there doors that you can find? Are there windows that open up onto the public realm? Is there privacy for people? That's what design is about. It's not the layering on the outside of the building. And you can shape design not with traditional zoning, but with design codes that should be objective. And the difference again between the left and the right is the left was built before the code was changed, and you see what you get at the ground floor at the public level. On the right-hand side, what you get is something that is usable by people and welcoming to people and creates a public realm that didn't exist on the left. Economics matters a lot, especially in a community like Rochester, which faces such extraordinary economic headwinds and disinvestment. And so creating the way we develop now with this spread out, sprawled area, the difference in value is extraordinary between the property values and the tax rolls on the left and on the right. The right is brand new. The left is older. But in study after study, it's been shown that there's greater land value and greater tax revenue from compact connected development. I don't know much about what's going on in Rochester, but I do know that it is important to spark homegrown economic development. A lot of cities salivate about getting the Amazon headquarters. That seems to bring as many problems as it does successes. And it's incredibly costly, and it is the competition for stealing somebody else's football team or corporation has meant that the price tag is high and the value to communities is now low. And so if Eastman Kodak didn't start because we stole, because Rochester stole it from New York City, the best and most sustainable economic development is bottom up. And most jobs in America come from small businesses anyway. This is from a radical group called the National Association of Realtors. They have demonstrated over and over again that for a significant segment of the market, walkability actually brings value. And we'll talk later on about gentrification, but it's really important to recognize that places that people love end up being more valuable. This also shows that younger people particularly have gotten tired of long commutes and the idea that they're going to be chained to a car. The public realm is important. This is in Southern California, in my territory. These are two essentially identical apartment buildings that have been built recently. One is in the city of Los Angeles, that's on the left, and the other is 3 blocks away in the city of Santa Monica on the same street. You can see one from the other. But you can see what West Hollywood has invested in, and the result is the businesses thrive, the residents thrive. People want to be in communities that invest in the public realm. And we can reimagine streets not as traffic sewers, but rather as people places. That's what streets have always been in timeless ways of building. Roads carry traffic from one place to another. But you don't want people to go from one place to another. You want a place in between, and that's what streets are for. You have done extraordinary success with the inner loop. You need to continue that effort to reclaim the places that have been given over to the automobile. And having greater density doesn't mean that you just jam in tall high rises. There needs to be, as we'll talk in a minute, about a missing middle. But there also needs to be, if you're going to have people closer together, you need also places for people to recreate and have a place where they have a greater connection to nature. So you have to build in those amenities as well. And you can, because the greater density gives you greater land value, which allows you to have the resources to create great people places like this. And infill matters. We have all of this territory that has been given over to the car, and it's an opportunity for us to recapture. Look at how much is given over to roads, to highways, to parking lots, and how disconnected this area is, which should have the highest land values in the whole region, should be the most fun, intense, vital, prosperous parts of the region. And yet the car has significantly degraded the quality of life and the economic health of your downtown. And so doing infill matters, and doing infill that is compatible with the character of the kind of neighborhood you want to build is moving toward a city that works for everyone, and including affordable housing and a mix of housing, so you don't just have a segregation by income. Mobility matters. We do need to continue to get around. We don't believe that cars should be abolished. We think that cars should be tamed to be at the service of people rather than cities and people being at the service of cars. That'll make our lives safer and more prosperous. A lot of talk these days about the 15-minute city. That's the idea that instead of driving 20 minutes to a big box, why not be able to have some of those services just in time close by, that you be able to by a bike or on foot, be able to get to most of your daily needs without having to get in your car. That means maybe a family only has to have one car instead of two or three. It also means changing our streets to reclaim them for not just cars, but for people and bicycles and public transit. It means connecting so that instead of tremendous amounts of traffic on our arterials, we disperse the traffic in ways that make it much less expensive, and we don't have to create these giant wide roads. This is a cartoon about a exasperated parent yelling at their kid, get off the computer and go outside, in the left-hand corner. And then you look at what that really means. They go outside. What is there to go to in most of our suburban environments? Choice matters. Not everyone wants to live in downtown. Not everyone wants to live in a 4-story building. Not everyone wants to live in a single family house at the end of a cul-de-sac, far from their old neighborhood. That's what new urbanists believe. We believe there should be what my grandmother preached, a place for everything and everything in its place. From rural, which should be rural and not covered with single family tract houses, to urban, which should appeal to people who want to be in a place where there's lots of activity going on 18 hours a day. And then in the middle, between the urban and the suburban, we should have small apartment buildings, duplexes, triplexes, garden apartments. Those are illegal in almost every city. Zoning precludes them. You only get single family or you get downtown environments. Planning matters a lot in creating an ideal city. This quote from Christopher Alexander, I think, says it all. Every increment of construction should be done in such a way as to heal the city. We sometimes say, well, we need a Starbucks in this neighborhood, or we need a Walgreens or a CVS or I'm not sure what they have in Rochester, a drugstore in our neighborhood, and we settle for suburban-oriented, auto-oriented, ugly, placeless development instead of realizing that every increment should really fit into creating the kind of places that we want, the kind of neighborhoods we want. So planning means involving those thousands of people, not just the people who come to the hearing when you send out the postcard, but making the case to everyone, young and old, rich and poor, people who not only have lived in the neighborhood for a long time, but be thinking about the people who will live in the neighborhood in future generations. And it means moving away from Crayola zoning, where we put colors on a map that doesn't tell us anything about what kind of place we're creating, to what we call form-based codes. Form-based codes mean that you have the opportunity to actually dictate, and I use that word clearly, to dictate the form of what you want to see so that you end up with the kind of neighborhood that you want to have at the end of the day. And those those are not mainly words, those are pictures. Those show what you actually want to have, so that front doors are on the sidewalk instead of at the back of a big parking lot, so that windows make it possible for people to walk along the street and see what's going on in a commercial district, so that you have setbacks for privacy, for where people live. All of that should be clearly spelled out. And you can in places where there's a historic feel in neighborhoods, you can begin to create some design elements. That's optional, but in places that want to share their history and want to enhance their history, that makes a lot of sense. People matter. You have an extraordinarily diverse population in Rochester, and everyone needs to have a seat at the table. That's challenging, but it means an ideal city is not a city for the people, it's also a city by the people. And getting toward the end here, but as happened all across America, there's been a racial reckoning in your hometown, in my hometown, in hometowns all over America. These go back to the days of Frederick Douglass, in which he warned us about a society, an unequal society. We have not made enough progress to live up to the dreams of Frederick Douglass, Martin Luther King, Sojourner Truth, Martin Luther King, and Lyndon Johnson, and countless other people in the South, in the North, and in the West, who put their lives on the line to change America and to create places where there was justice, where there was inclusion. There is a critical element of how we build our cities in all of this. That is not irrelevant to these issues. If we build cities that are far-flung, if we build cities where the rich live behind walls or in tall towers, if we live in cities where the poor are relegated to poorly designed and isolated public housing projects, or worse, left to live out on the streets and in tents. This is all part of creating an ideal city. That physical changes cannot solve these problems, but they can contribute to the solution. And if we ignore the physical way in which we build our neighborhoods and our downtowns, and if we pour billions into expanding freeways instead of billions into taking down some of these ugly scars that have divided our cities, then those are conscious choices that will come back to haunt our children and our grandchildren. My generation has not done as well as I had hoped to address some of the historic inequities in American society. But I hope that our generation can pass the torch to the next generation in a way that causes us to rebuild America over the next several decades, to address climate change, to address inclusive and equitable cities, and to reintroduce prosperity into cities that have been disinvested in. Climate migration is going to create new opportunities for cities like Rochester and Buffalo and other Rust Belt communities. And so the ideal city is one that looks to the future, and that, like Jerusalem, doesn't measure its successes in years or even decades, but in centuries and millennia. That may seem hard to grasp for a city as young as Rochester, and certainly for the newer cities that have sprung up since World War II. But if America wants to be around for a long time, if America wants to have a democracy for a long time, America needs to also build its cities to be sustainable, to be resilient, and to be equitable. And I hope that the elements that I've laid out here about vision, about planning, about economics, about the public realm, about design, that all those can contribute to the ideal city. Not some dream, not some design imposed from the top, but a bottom-up opportunity for people to build themselves the kind of communities, neighborhoods, and cities that they want to live in. That's Jerusalem over in the upper right-hand corner. So I hope that this has been helpful, and now I'm looking forward to the questions and the chat and the dialogue we're going to have for the remainder of our time together.
Thank you very much. I think it's very enlightening and a great kickoff to this year's series known as, labeled the Ideal City. I think, as you point out, the ideal city may not exist as a designation, but more as a journey that, everybody that is here today listening to you and has worked in this community throughout their careers realizes that it is a journey, and one that has ups and downs, and hopefully one that we're starting to see more enlightenment about some of the principles of new urbanism that the Congress has put forth. There are a couple of questions real quick. Could you just tell us what is your connection to Rochester?
So my parents met in the Korean War, like so many couples in that era did. And my dad was in the Air Force, and my mom was worked as a secretary. She left after high school from her home in Detroit and went to Alaska, where they met. And my dad returned to Rochester, which was his hometown. And he was at the time in the academy for the New York State Troopers, which he became. And so my mom went, and I was born in Detroit because Dad was in the academy and we didn't see much of him. But when he got out of the academy, we moved to a little house on Coldwater Road, and that's where I spent several years. My parents got divorced, and my mom and I moved to California, and that's how I became a Californian. But I've always had a soft spot for Rochester, and I think it's an extraordinary city, and so I was honored and delighted to be able to share a little bit of time with you today.
We do have several questions, and I'm sure more will pop up. I'm going to start with one from a longtime supporter and of the Community Design Center and a local activist, Suzanne Mayer. Suzanne asks, our new zoning code is Crayola, as you had termed it. How do we influence a change to form-based code as we go forward? And Rick, let me just, I want to add a little bit to that question. We do see a lot of resistance on the part of towns and local leadership in accepting form-based code. I think our Euclidean code that we've lived with for upwards of 70 plus years, and the segregated uses, and the metrics that we've established are so deeply ingrained in people's consciousness and the way they think about things that to transform or transition to something more design oriented and design based is just something we're seeing very, very difficult to get moving. Do you have some thoughts on how we can make the change to form based a little more acceptable?
Sure, several thoughts, and I'll try to be concise with each of them. First, zoning was imposed on American cities 70 years ago in a very problematic way that I think we ought to pay attention to. First of all, it was single family zoning was invented to keep Black people out of a neighborhood in Berkeley, California. And I think that history is being uncovered, like so much of our history that we've either forgotten or suppressed. And I think understanding that the origins, that's something that young people, I think, are paying more attention to and not taking for granted that these things have to be the way they were, that there's some things that we can change. Secondly, it didn't just happen that all of a sudden every city in America besides Houston adopted zoning codes. Herbert Hoover, who was the Secretary of Commerce, pushed that on cities that they should adopt codes. So I think there has to be a national movement. Rochester can't do this alone. No community can do this alone. In California, some of the changes are coming at the state level, and I think that may be a way in New York State for some of this. But I think the most important thing is to recognize that something I learned in governing as a elected official and as an appointed one, people are not going to buy the answer until they own the problem, right? And so if you tell them, oh, we got this newfangled idea and we're going to take away the things that you feel protect you and your safety and your property values and your sense of community, and we're going to impose this newfangled thing called a form-based code that you never heard of, and it's all going to be great, that's not likely to work. But I think if we, again, get people around tables and talk about what kind of community do you want? Do you want a place where your kids want to live and can afford to live? Do you want a place where you can retire when you, like my mom, who's 90, who doesn't want to keep up a three-bedroom house anymore, but still wants to stay in the neighborhood where my sister lives and where she knows, her hairdresser and everything else. Get people around tables and talk about what kind of communities we want, and then to offer the tool and to help explain to people why this can help them get the kind of communities that they want and yearn for. But to just tell people, oh, we're going to take away your zoning and we're going to give you this form-based code, that's never going to work. But I think there needs to be a deep conversation with people about what do they want, starting with principles and values, and then working toward the tools that come with urban planning. If you just talk about the tools, I think people are going to resist it, and I understand why.
Some of what we experience in upstate New York, and probably in other places as well, is not necessarily a completely form-based code, but kind of a hybrid form-based code where land uses are still included in the code. Do you and the Congress see this type of hybrid between form-based and Euclidean being an effective tool in creating community?
We're actually working with AARP on exactly that model, and we've done a number of pilot projects in different communities over, particularly in the Midwest, of cities that aren't prepared to just junk their existing zoning code, but want to improve it because they're seeing the problems with their traditional code. And so we've gone in and we've shown them some of the things that that they don't mean to do, but that are embedded in their code. For example, they'll have a beautiful older downtown, and a restaurant can't come in without tearing down the building next door to them and building parking, because the code says you have to have this number of spaces for every restaurant table. So that's a way in which you can change your code. You can say, for in this district, instead of imposing those kind of parking requirements, there'll be a dispensation. That's what we did in Pasadena to protect our historic core, which was being torn down to make way for parking lots, which was bad for revenue, bad for business, and bad for the community. And so we created a parking strategy where we were able to build parking structures so that people could park in the parking structures, and instead of tearing down historic buildings to make way for surface parking. There's some economic challenges to that. Those are solvable. But the reality is that there are ways in which we can transition from the codes that dictate we build suburbia to codes that create places that people love. That's possible to do by incremental reform. And the more that spreads and the more it works and the more people figure out how to make it work, I think the easier it gets to continue to change these codes and continue to introduce better tools. Again, the last 70 years, people are really fixated on. But if you take the long view of history, this is not how we've built the places we love. And the irony is that the places people, nobody wants to go vacation in suburban strips. No one goes and says, "Oh, let's go to you know, we had a great time. We went to the Arby's in Birmingham, Alabama." Um, the people go to places that were built for human beings because that's what human beings like. And it's possible, and it's actually smart to build those kind of places today. And if we do that, we'll be more prosperous, we'll be happier, and we'll be less divided by race and income.
Uh, Rick, there are many issues that you brought up, and I'm sure you're well aware of kind of the what's going on in the country with regard to real estate values,
Hmm.
and how housing is hard to find. Prices are skyrocketing everywhere, both from an acquisition standpoint and from a rental standpoint. And yet we're all hyper aware of things like affordable housing and inclusive housing.
Mhm.
And I guess this goes to a question from Brady Ferguson, who says, "How should cities like Rochester prepare for climate change? Climate change mitigation."
Or
Well,
migration?
I'm sorry, migration. I apologize. While also working to solve problems faced by the people living there now, such as lack of sufficient affordable housing. You know,
Mhm.
competing interests, where maybe moving toward electrification and away from fossil fuels
Mhm.
is one goal in climate change, but what does that do to the cost of housing?
Mhm.
There's definitely different interests and things we have to kind of try and manage.
If there were a simple answer, then we could simply implement it. Um, I think one huge embedded factor that we don't pay enough attention to is the way in which we have made it very difficult to build housing at scale, that isn't at the far fringes of identical single family houses. That we have made extremely easy compared to everything else in the way of housing. We made it difficult to add a unit in the back, which was very common in cities. We made it very difficult to create the single room occupancy or the boarding house, which was a great opportunity, and that we see the results in homelessness of people falling out of the bottom of our system. We make it very difficult for local developers to build things because we make the rules so stringent and onerous that Joe Smith can't make a living at it. Smith Incorporated, backed by giant pension funds and Wall Street, have the ability to meet those onerous rules and to wait time for places to get around to approving things. So the rules should be clear, and it should be easy for little guys as well as Wall Street to be able to build stuff. And we should be able to build small infill and add on to things that we already have, and put rear units or put an apartment above a garage. Make that simple, so that we create additional opportunities of all different kinds of housing. Will that solve the problem next week or next month? Absolutely not. We've spent 70 years on a really disastrous path of saying we're going to either build single family houses out on the far fringe of our cities, or we're going to come in with 4 and 5 or taller apartment buildings, in the center of cities, and pretty much left everything else abandoned. As retail declines, and it is declined, and it's not coming back. Amazon is not going out of business. There's all of these vast areas of strip that need to be reclaimed and tamed. These wide boulevards, 4 or 6 lane highways, those need to be reclaimed because people are not going to be spending all day Saturday going from big box to big box to big box. Big boxes are going to be delivered to their houses. So a lot of that space is going to be freed up. And there's an opportunity not just to build crappy apartment buildings on those strips, but to really reclaim them as new neighborhoods for the future. Bill, I think you are muted.
I did somehow get muted. Sorry. Mary Myers asks a question: a spot for everything and everything in a spot. Is there room for messiness around the edges for neighborhoods to claim their own space?
Oh, yeah, I don't mean to suggest an antiseptic view. In fact, I think that organized complexity is, in fact, what an evolution and, if you will, messiness is important. I think that what I'm talking about, though, is there should be a coherence, right? A lot of people fear when we use the word urbanism, particularly older people, they think, oh, that means Hong Kong, right? Or Manhattan, right? And I live in a nice, quiet neighborhood. I know my neighbors, and you're going to bring in a 5-story apartment building next door to me, and I won't know anybody, and it'll be the end of my happy life. That's different from allowing a triplex in the neighborhood or a corner grocery store. That's the kind of messiness that I think is an evolution. Chuck Marone of Strong Towns has done just a great job of that, and I hope he'll be a speaker for you in the future. There does need to, real places grow and change, but they should grow and change in a way that is graceful and not disruptive. And there's a way to do that by moving away again from Crayola zoning and allowing similar scale but more enriched uses, smaller units, bigger units, some compatible commercial, not an auto plant in a neighborhood, but again, why not a hairdresser or a barber shop or a little commercial node that's within walking distance, a park that isn't at the fringe next to the freeway, but is located in the middle of a neighborhood. That has not been the case for most of the new tracks that have been built over the last 30 or 40 years. I've seen tremendous success in redesigning new development so that it's built to have a mix of walkable uses and to be that kind of 15-minute city that you can get to by bike or on foot. And that means less traffic, and that means less greenhouse gas emissions. And that means less money being paid to the insurance company and the oil companies and all of that. It's a win-win-win.
Monika also is a local planner here, specializing in zoning and planning, works across both the city and some of our suburban towns in the area. And she kind of has a statement / question here, and I'll try and read the part. Rochester, in my opinion, is a city at the hands of the suburbs where the loudest voice does not generally embrace the principles of new urbanism and social justice. How do we bridge this gap more effectively? What efforts has CNU played or undertaken to facilitate these conversations and advocate for this very much needed change in policy and development approach?
Yeah. Great statement, great question, great challenge. And one that's very much on my mind because over the weekend there was quite a bit of chatter because one of the founders of the Congress for New Urbanism was on Tucker Carlson, and very respectful, very thoughtful interview in which Andres Duany, a legendary architect in Miami who's done remarkable work as a new urbanist over the last 30 years, got an opportunity to share those views with Tucker Carlson's viewers. Well, a lot of people don't like Tucker Carlson, and for reasons that I won't belabor, and so a lot of chatter about that. If we're going to, the word used was bridge. If you're going to build a bridge, bridges are two-way, right? So it means a little bit clenching our teeth and holding our nose and listening to things that we don't agree with on both sides, right? And it's easy to say, well, when Tucker Carlson stops blah 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 blah, then I'll talk to him, or for Tucker Carlson and the folks who listen to him to say, well, when AOC stops blah 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 blah, then we'll talk to them. And the reality is that we're actually going to drift further apart as an American society if we don't create dialogue. And there's always reasons for demonizing the other side, because the other side, whoever they are, do stupid things in an environment where stupid things make you a lot of money, right? Tucker Carlson and Rachel Maddow and all of these screaming people on television who are constantly telling us the world is coming to an end and it's the fault of those other Americans who are not like you, and so we should hate them and we should do whatever we can to stop them. That's making an enormous amount of money because people are amped up to watch these things, to see what terrible thing the other side did this week. That way lies at the end of our democracy, and probably some form of violent upheaval. The bridges means talking to the folks in the suburbs and asking them to talk to the people in the inner city and beginning to build those bridges. And that's unbelievably difficult. So I made mention of when I was mayor of Pasadena, we were in that kind of toxic situation. The people who, because we were a rapidly growing Southern California city, and the older folks, but not so much age-wise as people who'd been in the community, like myself, who'd grown up in the community, adamantly concerned about the traffic and the congestion and the problems that have not been as big in inner city Rochester in the last decades, but were acute problems for Pasadena as we grew. And then there were people who were saying, well, this is what's going to bring jobs and prosperity and revenue to the city, so we can afford parks and libraries and police and fire. And they were at each other's throats. And there was the reason we ended up having to do a new general plan was because we'd had an election in which the citizens forced an initiative on the city council, and then there was a lawsuit which the city, because the city council didn't like the citizen initiative, they sold it out, and so we had to start over again from scratch, and there was real hatred and hostility between these two camps. And I was kind of the leader of the growth skeptics, and my counterpart, the vice mayor, she was the leader of the pro-business, pro-development, let's pave over everything group. And fortunately, we had a personal relationship that transcended our political differences and our age differences. And I said, well, you're going to be the next mayor. You're the vice mayor, and why don't we work together and see if we can find some common ground? And that's when we challenged the community to come together, and we got them around tables. We got people who said, well, I'm not going to talk to that person. That person's a blah 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 blah, and we got them to sit down and we got them to talk. And it turned out that they had more in common than they ever thought. And after a while, people began to say, well, we were never against all development. We just didn't like this stupid out of scale development that was choking our streets with traffic. But we understand that cities need to grow. And then the other side was saying, well, we were never for, paving over everything, even though it sounded like it at the time. No, we think that the growth should be thoughtful and contribute to the community and be and hold its value over time. So people began edging toward that. I don't know how to do that at the scale of Rochester. That's something you all have to figure out. But I think it's worth making that effort, because I think that folks in the suburbs will say, well, we were never, racist. We never wanted to cut ourselves off from Rochester. We love the inner city. And people in the inner city will say, well, we never thought you were all white supremacists. We just, we were concerned about, your policies and the way it was affecting, justice in our communities. I can't promise that, but I can predict that, because I've seen it happen over and over again. When people sit down and realize that that they share the same aspirations for their children, that they believe in fairness. The definition of fairness will vary widely, but at least they believe in the principle of fairness. And that if you get people away from the shouting and the media which actually exploits that shouting, you can build bridges. I don't see any way around it, frankly, other than a really dark future for America's cities.
Rick, Alan Obrist from Buffalo, here's that Alan has been working on some of the redos or overhauls of some of the expressways there, and some of those, CNU identifies as, those highways that are no longer
We call them freeways without futures.
Freeways without futures. And so Buffalo does have several, and Piers Allen is joining us from Buffalo and working on those. His question here is, with the passage of the infrastructure bill, you say that infrastructure is one of our biggest opportunities right now for revising our cities, both in terms of removing bad infrastructure like urban expressways and adding the kind of infrastructure we need to build density and walkability like high capacity transit. Mm-hmm. There's a couple other comments here, but around the ULI and CNU, what you're doing to help shape communities and help in leveraging your ideas with the infrastructure bill.
Yeah, I think that infrastructure is one of those words that people eyes glaze over. We had infrastructure week for every week in the Trump administration and not much action. And the infrastructure bill that was passed and signed into law will be a while before we see the good and the bad that comes of it. This again goes to the divided way in which Americans now view the world. There are those who say that infrastructure is pouring more cement and paving over more of America, and frankly continuing to relocate people in neighborhoods out of the way of expanded freeways in the middle of cities. And then there are folks who are saying, no, infrastructure is repairing what we already have, some of the bridges that are falling down, some of the highways and roads that are not being kept up, and creating an infrastructure that isn't just giant pharaonic structures, but actually ways in which we can be smarter and more environmentally sustainable and cheaper in the way in which we solve our problems. Just one example, there's a huge health benefit to figure out a way of getting rid of human waste, which has always been a challenge for every city and every town in history. And so we built sewers all over America and sewer treatment plants, and we stopped dumping our sewage into rivers and streams and lakes. All that's a good idea, but when you think about how much water and energy goes into that system, and that we're now flushing that treated sediment into our rivers and our lakes and our streams, instead of recapturing that and using fossil-based fuel for fertilizer instead of the nutrients that remain once they've been recycled. There are ways in which we can have much less expensive and intrusive infrastructure. We installed compostable toilets in our new office building in the city of Santa Monica. There was a great hue and cry, oh my goodness, that's going to be stinky and terrible, and nobody likes to talk about the S word. But the reality is that it's, in the long run, way cheaper than flushing it with a gallon or 2 or 3 gallons of water every time we need to. And then we get to recapture those nutrients. So we actually have built a building that doesn't require any energy from outside, all powered by solar and wind and passive design. Doesn't need any water because we have very little of it in Southern California, unlike in upstate New York. And doesn't require any landfill because we're recycling or composting everything that's coming out of the system. So that's possible. It is upfront more expensive, but over the long run, and the long run being like 20 years, not 500 years, we end up saving the taxpayers money. So infrastructure, I think we need to do a rethink on. We are not having that intelligent conversation because people are screaming at each other instead of thinking together about how to save money and how to improve the environment and the quality of our lives.
Thank you. Richard Glazer asks a question, again, a longtime supporter of the Design Center and activist here in town. Richard's question is, where does the buck stop? Buffalo adopted a form-based / green code 5 years ago. It's our neighbor. We share so much in common, yet Rochester is lagging and showing resistance to new urbanism principles. We have an active grassroots movement. Is there a problem at the top? Mayor is written in here, planning bureaucracy or the city charter. And Rick, I'll just add that, as you were going through your comments on what matters in the bullets you were putting, I did notice that leadership, does leadership matter? And this might be part of Richard's question, but it does seem that Buffalo took an initiative and they adopted the code 5 years ago, but they started it much earlier than that, as you can imagine. And, combined an awful lot of local planning studies and did an environmental review on multiple studies together. It was a massive effort to put that together. So just wonder your thoughts on.
So in addition to my day job as executive director of the Congress for New Urbanism, I teach public policy. This semester I'm teaching at Pepperdine University in the School of Public Policy, and my class is on leadership, leading cities. And I would respond this way. Yes, positions that come with leadership titles, mayor, council president, council member, president of the Chamber of Commerce, university president, etc. That matters, absolutely. But what truly matters is the leadership of the people on this call, right? It's we've got 68 people on this call, right? In a city that's much bigger, and I would go to what Margaret Mead said is never underestimate the impact of a small group of like-minded people um, to make change. And in fact, they're the only people who ever have. So the 68 people on the call, many of whom I would guess are older, like me and you. Um, and and the reality is that we hope for a shortcut, right? Some leader, some smart, tough, charismatic leader will emerge and do the right thing, whatever the right thing happens to be, depending upon our political and interest in society might be. But there's no substitute for organizing, for reaching out to people of different viewpoints, reaching out to people who are paying attention to K-pop or sports teams or the latest food trend, and not to write them off, but to say, hey, um, we know you're interested in basketball, or we know you're interested in music, or but young people, if you're going to be able to own a home, if you're going to grow up in a society that's not going to be racially divided as it's been for generations, if you need to get involved in your city, you need to get involved in how your city is planned, and to make that case and to listen to them as well, and not just preach at them, but to talk with them and to bring them into the movement and to broaden the movement. There's no substitute for that. I got elected at 29 by knocking on doors, ran against an incumbent, vastly outspent. He was endorsed by everybody, the police and fire unions and the newspaper and the Chamber of Commerce and all of the powerful people in my hometown. But I talked to 1,000 people at their door. Some of them invited me into their kitchen. Some of them invited me in for a cup of coffee in their living room. Some of them came out on the porch and we sat down and talked. Um, and I got 58% of the vote. I carried every precinct against an incumbent who everyone said couldn't be beaten. And I did it not by telling that I was at 29, that I had all the answers and I was going to make their life magically better, but by listening to them and understanding their needs and their wants and challenging them to be partners with me. I represented the low income part of the city, and those folks had been shut out. We had, out of some 150 commissioners, in the city, we had two from my district, which was 1/7 of the city. And when I left office, we had parity with the more affluent and wealthy districts in a city that was pretty top down when I started. And it was because, that's I think leadership. Leadership is if people follow you. It isn't a title that you get or is given to you or that you grab for. Leadership is when you get other people to say, that person makes a lot of sense, and I'm willing to give them some trust, and I'm willing to support and back them, and I'm willing to rein them in and tell them when they're off base in a friendly way, to make sure that they continue to represent us in a good way. That's leadership, and there's no easy way to get it, but it is worthwhile. It is possible to change a city. I'll just finish with this. I grew up in a town after leaving Rochester and moving with my mother as a single mom to Pasadena, California. I grew up with the Tournament of Roses, right? It's world famous. On January 1st, we're the capital of the world, at least the United States part of it, and much beyond. Just like Mardi Gras belongs to New Orleans, New Year's Day pretty much belongs to us and our parade and our football game. I loved that. I could go anywhere in America and tell people I was from Pasadena, and people say, "Oh, Pasadena, oh, parade, Rose Bowl." Sometimes they'd even know that Caltech was there. But it also presented an image that was not true about our town. That we were a bunch of white girls that, you know, waved on television in beautiful sunshine when in fact, we were a town where Jackie Robinson went to high school with my dad, and when he left, vowed never to come back because of its racist policies, where black and brown kids couldn't swim in the local pool except one day a week, and they told the white parents that they drained it the next day. Um, the image we were broadcasting the world wasn't an honest one. It was a happy and you know, airbrushed view of the world, and that made me angry. And it particularly made me angry that the Tournament of Roses leadership was all white and all male in a city that was half female and nearly half people of color. And so as vice mayor, I took them on, and became the most unpopular guy in Pasadena. Because when my first ride in the parade, I wore a T-shirt that said "Tournament of Racism." I wore it under my shirt, but that secret didn't stay out long. So I was vilified. But I stuck to my guns, and the tournament integrated, and we found common ground. We did some quiet negotiations, and ultimately, you know, the president of the tournament, you know, they had their first woman president, they had their first black president. They now make real contributions to the community, which they didn't do before. Everything about the parade has been subtly altered to be more inclusive. I tell that long story because not because Rochester, you know, is Pasadena, but because leadership doesn't just emerge, you know, because we pray for it or hope for it. Leadership emerges from the crucible of struggle. That's what Frederick Douglass said. Frederick Douglass said, "There is no progress without struggle." And if I can paraphrase his exact quote, it was something like, you know, those who want progress but deprecate struggle are those that want, you know, the blessings of the rain without the thunder and the lightning. You need the thunder and the lightning. You need the people willing to knock on doors and listen and talk to people. You need to build a movement. And I hope you'll plug into the national movement. The people in Buffalo can help the people in Rochester. The people in Buffalo and Rochester can learn from the people in Oklahoma City. The people in Oklahoma City can teach the rest of the country about what they're doing to tear down freeways and what Rochester's doing. The 68 people, if we're still on, let's see, now we're down to 65 now. The 65 people that are on this call, hang in there, don't lose faith. There is no progress without struggle, but if we keep struggling, there will be progress.
Rick, thank you so much. I think several of the people, many of the 64 remaining, you'll probably see in Oklahoma City this year, and probably less than a few weeks, right?
That'd be great.
Congress.
And I look forward to my showing up on the ground in Rochester. Again, my roots are there, and I wish you the very best. I think it is a great American city, and I think that it deserves to have its best days ahead of it rather than behind it. And for those people who have been tenacious and who have been courageous and who have been putting on this lecture series for 17 years, you have made a great contribution. And now it's going to be important to make sure that the next generation, in their own way, carries on this struggle to restore Rochester to being one of America's great cities.
Rick, thank you. I'm going to just quickly turn it over to Monika. We do have some wrap-up slides, but on behalf of the Community Design Center, our board, all of the folks that have joined us today, want to thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes, so thank you both very much for an engaging Q&A. Rick, thank you for your presentation. We want to let everyone know that there'll be a follow-up community conversation 1 week from today, also at noon on Zoom. We're going to be having a conversation led by our board member, Howard Decker, and we're going to continue to discuss the ideas and strategies that Rick presented in his presentation today. So we hope that you'll join us for that. And we also hope that you'll join us next month, exactly 1 month from today, for our next presentation with Dr. Andre Perry. He's going to be discussing equity and affordability in housing. He's a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, and also you might be aware of his recent book called Know Your Price, Valuing Black Lives and Property in America's Black Cities. He will be drawing upon some research that references Rochester specifically, which is included in that book, and some additional research that has happened since then. So you don't want to miss it. Just another reminder that we do have a survey. It will pop up naturally on your browser when you close out of Zoom. So please do take that. We read all of the responses and we take all of your opinions into account. With that, thank you all again for joining us. A recording is going to be distributed to all of you by the end of the week. You're welcome to share that with your colleagues or watch it again yourself if you're really into it. Thanks again, Rick, for your presentation. Take care, everyone, and be well.